And lastly, as far as the custom hooks, let me show you how we can make our function more generic, basically our use fetch person. Because, I mean, chances are we'll probably want to fetch more than just a user. For example, we want to fetch an array or something along those lines. So again, the functionality pretty much is going to stay the same. We'll just change some names and what we're returning from the function. And as a result, we'll be able to use the custom fetch hook with pretty much any data, not just with a user object. So let's try this one out, where first I want to navigate to the star. I'll create a new file and I'll call this use fetch. Pretty generic, correct? And then pretty much I want to take the whole thing. One by one, we'll just change some values. So copy and paste over here. And instead of user, why don't we call this data? I think that's pretty generic, correct? So data and set data. And as far as default value, I'll still keep it as a null. Then we want to change around the name. It's not going to be fetch user. I'll actually call this fetch data. And I just need to remind myself that pretty much everywhere where I have fetch user, I want to also rename it to a fetch data. So fetch data here, and then we also invoke it. Now, I don't have user anymore. I have the data. So instead of user, from this hook, I'm returning a data. And then lastly, notice over here, as far as the response, I'm calling this a user. Well, we can come up with response. So that's going to be pretty generic, where I'm going to go with set data and I'll set it equal to response. Now let's save it. We want to navigate to fetch data and let me double check. Yep. Of course, I have a mess up here. It's not fetch person. I'm going to go with use and then fetch, and same over here. Now, technically this should work because the export is default, but I'm going to rename that, and then back in the fetch data, instead of use person, I'll remove this, and we want to set it from the scratch, where I'm going to go with use and then fetch, and we still want to pass in the URL. Now you're probably wondering, okay, but what about the user? Since that's what we're using in this component. Well, we're not getting back any more user. This is actually data. So we have two options. You can remove the user and go with data, but then just keep in mind that everywhere where you have reference to a user, you also need to use data, or you can simply add an alias. Again, a JavaScript thing where I'm saying, yeah, I want to grab the data out of the use fetch. However, in this component, I'm going to call this a user. That's it. Notice, everything still works. Only in this case, we have the generic one, which effectively we can take from project to project. And then every time we want to get some data, we just invoke the use fetch, pass in the URL. And if everything's correct, we have no errors. Once we're done loading, we'll get back the data.